Thank you, Jenny. I just want to take up a few minutes to thank Jasmine for allowing me to kind of be a part of this awesome event to honor one of our alum who's opening up discourse in the literary world, as well as in her scholarly endeavors and kind of bringing that back to this community. I think it's been really amazing to engage with PA, especially over the last few months, when a lot of issues of race and racism have been lifted up in our nation, and this diverse community of our innovative, educated minds coming together kind of in love and in that blue spirit to have some kind of generative discussions on this and kind of expand each other's understanding of how to have these types of conversations is super spectacular. I've really appreciated it, especially when everyone was quarantining, seeing some faces I hadn't seen in a long time. And so this is an extension of that. And I put some notes here in the chat. I also wanted to kind of say and I've had a ton of conversations, I'm sure many of you have in your networks and in your important work, that we're not necessarily gonna solve racism in the next hour, right? But we are gonna be able to share our personal experience as individuals in the roles we hold in our worlds, within our families, within our work, and within a system, within a larger system. And I think discourse is part of the beginnings of that. And so I also had a quote here before I get to share a little bit about Jasmine, which is, I guess to say that alum of PA, especially alum of color, I think kind of are leading in a lot of the spaces that I get to witness of lifting up some of these issues across different systems, the educational system, the legal system, social activism, and entrepreneurial places. And a lot of there are a lot of gaps in some of the ways that these stories have been told. And I'm excited to know a lot of the people that are like creating new stories, such as Jasmine. So I read this quote the other day and I brought it here, which is, if there's a book that you want to read, but it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. And I think that speaks to, that's a Toni Morrison quote that, you know, kind of highlights to me what a conversation like this and a book like this brings to the table. So I'll share a little bit about Jasmine, which is a PA class of 99. Again, if folks want to add their class years to your names, please do so. And also to say that the layout of this conversation will be time for Jasmine to speak, share a little bit, maybe read a little bit from her book or share a little bit about the inspiration and the topic. And then during her speaking, you can throw questions into the chat box, though she will have time to speak for a while. I will kind of moderate and select some of your questions later on, maybe give some space for folks to ask it themselves. You know, I'll kind of like play around with some interactive and also just me reading out in the interest of time. And then towards the end, we'll try to do like a little bit of some breakouts so that folks can have a little bit of smaller conversations before we close. So that's the layout of this. So again, Jasmine Mitchell is PA class of 99, and she's an assistant professor of American Studies and Media Studies at the State University of New York, Old Westbury. And her specialties, her scholarly specialties include race and gender representation in popular culture, mixed race, African Americans and Afro-Brazilians, Black feminism, and race and sports. And pardon me. And she's going to be talking to us a little bit about her recent publication, Imagining the Mulatta, Blackness in US and Brazilian Media. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to Jasmine Mitchell.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm so pleased to see so many of your faces. It's been a long time seeing so many of you, and especially under quarantine. You know, sometimes I feel like, is this I Am Legend right, going on here? So I do. I am so grateful to be part of this community. So first, I just kind of wanted to start a little bit with how I came to this book, and then I'm gonna walk through some of the main arguments, right? Basically, give you like the clip notes, right, version of this book, and then Lethy, if you need to gong me at any point, because I'm talking too much, please do. Okay, so first I just wanted to, I think, all books, right? I don't care what it is, right? Really come from one's individual vantage point, right? And I actually think those are assets, right? It using the unique vantage points, right, of our lived experiences. And so I came to Andover. I grew up, working class in Brooklyn, that in an area of Park Slope, which now is super gentrified, right, and really hot right now. But at the time when I came to Andover, almost no one had heard of it. They said, "Where is this place?" And I grew up with an African American mother from West Philadelphia, which is where I was born, and a white father from rural Pennsylvania. Right? And that upbringing, right, really shaped my worldview and my research interests. And some of my interests or questions, specifically around Blackness, right, and mixed Blackness, right, in the Americas, it started to actually come about through Andover. And so I arrived at Andover, and I don't think I quite understood about a systemic racism. Right? I grew up, right, with working class whites, right, in Brooklyn, right, that were, super tough, right, working class. And when I got to Andover, I don't think I fully grasped the understanding of a white privilege, or how I was going to be othered, right? How I was going to be thought of as different, as an object of curiosity. Many times I had other students say, "Oh, you're the first Black person I've ever talked to," or "What are you?" Right? Well, where are you from? And when I would say, "Oh, I'm from Brooklyn," no, where are you from? Where are your parents from? And what I started to understand is what people really wanted to know, right, is that they really wanted to know what my racial background was, so that they knew how to interact with me. Right? But also being in Andover, right, being with students from all over the world, right, and getting more of a global understanding of how racial difference is thought about, right, also inspired this book. So going back to Andover, this idea of mixed race people as a new people, right, started to gain a lot of traction in the 1990s. Right? And I found that really confusing. Right? That somehow mixed race people are these brand new people, right? There were all these magazines like Time, Newsweek, right, talking about mixed race people as the people of the future. And I had a hard time understanding that, because my mother's background, right, as African American, we had always understood that there was racial mixing. Right? So we would go to family reunions, right? I have aunts that are actually much lighter skinned, right, than I am. But there was this understanding that we're all Black. So I started to, also question a little bit, well, why is this being thought of as new, right, right now? Right? Why is there this so-called discovery, right, of mixed race peoples and new people, when really racial mixing has been going on since colonization, right, in the Americas? So what are the political stakes here? Then, everything again comes from personal experience often. When I traveled to Brazil for the first time in 2000, right, I myself brought into this myth, right, of Brazil was a racial paradise. Hey, and I was not alone in that, right? So like many other African Americans, right, I thought, oh, this is going to be my spot. Right? I'm ready to go. Right? I'm going to fit in here, because Brazil had long promoted itself as this racial democracy in which racial mixing and the lack of legal segregation, right, made it unique, right? Made it unlike the US, right, in which racism does not exist in Brazil. And I soon learned I was very wrong in that. And so my first job out of college was actually teaching at the American School in Sao Paulo. And myself and another African American male teacher were the first Black teachers that the school had ever had. Okay? Which is pretty amazing in of itself when we're thinking about how ideas of race travel. So right off the bat, people thought that I was, one of the, domestic cleaning staff. Right? I would have condoms thrown at me, like in the street, right? Because there was this presumption, right, of thinking of women who looked like me, right, as not supposed to be in those spaces. And so I said, oh, okay, this idea of white supremacy is actually traveling, as well as this idea of Black women as being sexually available. Okay, so that, that's just some of the background here, right? And I had a lot of questions, right? Why does Brazil proclaim itself to be this racial democracy, and yet almost all the media images were white? Almost everyone in government was white. Almost all the business sectors were white. The University of Sao Paulo, which is where I did much of the research for this book, only 1% of the professors are Black, and the country is majority Black. So I said, okay, there's a contradiction here. So that again, right, led me to many of these questions for this book, and I'm just gonna screen share just a little bit just to kind of walk us through, if that's okay. Okay, so you can email me if you ever want to follow up with questions. I'd love to talk more. But some of the big questions that I had, right? So how does the mixed Black female figure embody contradictions of racial inequality and racial harmony? And how does the Mulata figure, right? So the Mulata, right, is this idea, right, of a woman of mixed African and European descent. How does she actually mask anti-Blackness in the Americas? Right? And again, I don't think this is unique to the US and Brazil, right? But I was really using the US and Brazil, as my case studies here. And furthermore, right, what does pop culture tell us? Right? So what are films like Fast Five, or music videos, or how we think about Halle Berry, right? How does that actually reinforce, right, these ideologies of white supremacy, right? And really actually of white patriarchy. So those were my key questions. And some of this goes back again to what I would say is actually a fetishization of mixed Black female bodies, right? So I see these kinds of images, over and over again, right? Especially starting in the 1990s, right? But this image here from National Geographic is from 2018, right? Where there's this obsession, right, with mixed Black female bodies, right, as a vision of the future. Right? And so I'm really interested, right, in what is this obsession, right, with this vision of the future, and how is Blackness being presented as something that's archaic, right, as something that's actually in the past, right, while ignoring structural racism, right, which I think, again, if we talk about, I hope we get to it later, talk about the debates last night, right, we can see a lot, right, of how mixed Black female figures, right, often get put up as these emblems of racial progress in order to allow for a disavowal of systemic racism. Okay, so often there's this description of mixed Black women as beautiful, as exotic, as the future, right? While at the same time, right, here, let me get back to this here. We have in Brazil, right, they have these images that the Brazilian state itself sells. Hey, so you can find these on like postcards. If you think of Carnaval, right? If you think of Samba and the Samba parades, right? So the image that Brazil markets itself on, right, is this idea of racial mixing, which allows for Brazil to be a racial paradise, and a sensual racial paradise, in which the Mulata figure, right, the mixed Black female figure, is literally offered as proof of this racial harmony, right, as proof of this racial utopia. So I just want to kind of go back to why the US and Brazil, because I get that question a lot, right? Why the US and Brazil? And I think we actually, in order to understand anti-Blackness, right, we need to look not just at the US, right, not just at Brazil, right, not just at the Dominican Republic, right? We can do this with so many countries, not just at Colombia, right? But really trying to understand how histories of slavery and colonization, right, none of these countries in the Americas have actually really grappled with these legacies, right? And we're haunted by these legacies today. Right, but I look at the US and Brazil in particular because of the histories of slavery and emancipation, the large populations of African descent. So Brazil actually has the largest population of African descent outside of Nigeria, right? The largest in the world, right? But that's not the way, right, that Brazil often chooses to project its image in the world. Right? Both have large media industries, right? In the US, we're pretty myopic, right, on our own media industries, right? But the Brazilian telenovela industry, right, which are kind of like serial melodramas, right? Those are exported to over 50 countries in the world. So the ways that we're talking about white supremacy and about anti-Blackness, that's not just happening in the US, that's happening in Brazil, and those ideas are also traveling. Right? And I'm also interested in how in both countries, how mixed Black female figures, right, the idea of the Mulata, right, becomes a key symbol in their national identities. Right? But then with a caveat, right, I also want to point to two important differences. Right, so Brazil again did not have legal segregation. That doesn't mean they have de facto segregation. Right? They have this myth of racial democracy, right, that racial mixing is actually what gives Brazil this hybrid vigor, and they're not the racists. That's the U.S. Okay, and then this is important. Right? In Brazil, race is based on phenotype, on what you look like, right? Whereas in the United States, right, it's based on ancestry, right? We have this, these relics of the one drop rule, right, and Jim Crow, of hypo descent, right? That one drop of Black blood makes you Black. And that's where it gets interesting, right? Is that most academic studies of comparative race relations actually study the U.S. and Brazil. Okay, so that's the most common study. And the US and Brazil are often presented as they're so different from each other. And in this book, I actually want to say they're actually not, right? They're really not. So part of this is that the US has this US exceptionalism, right, that we saw in the VP debates last night too, right? If we think we're these beacons of freedom to the world and that we can be these models, right, of racial progress, right? Models of racial harmony. Right, that we have these stories of only in the United States. Like, well, not really. Is it only in the United States? And Brazil, right, also thinks of itself as exceptionalist. Right? So especially after World War II, right, when the UN, right, is looking to, oh, how do we stop right, racial violence? Brazil raises its hand and said, oh, it's us. Right? We've got the answer. But no, right? Both of these countries, right, are actually exceptionalist, right? And that they think that they're unique, right? But they're actually very similar, right? In terms of structural racism, of racial violence, and particularly the ways in which white patriarchy works to exploit, right, mixed Black women and particularly mixed Black female figures. Okay? So that's a little bit why. And really the core argument here is the mixed Black female body actually in popular media, right, works as a vehicle to support and consolidate white supremacy and acts actually to discipline people of African descent. And it does so through regulating women's bodies, disciplining women's bodies, okay, or by trying to contain Blackness itself. Right? And this is all, right, again, why we have to think intersectionally, right, of how race, gender, and sexuality, right, are working together. Right? So this is really all about, again, right, control, right, of Black women's bodies to contain, right, the Black populations in the US and Brazil. Right? Because there's this fear of Blackness. At the same time, right, there's a desire, a fetishization of Black women's bodies. kind of come through. Okay, so here's the other thing in Brazil, right? It has this idea of racial democracy. Racial mixing is what makes us unique. At the same time, there's this whitening project, right? So this painting here, A Dançando de Cam, right, is from 1895, and Brazil, like the U.S., right, had mass European immigration. Right, the Brazilian state actually subsidized, right, European immigration, right, after emancipation. Brazil, by the way, right, was the last country to abolish slavery, right, in the Americas, right, held on strong to that for a long time. And there's this idea, right, if we see here on the left-hand side, right, of the formerly enslaved Black grandmother praising God that her mixed race daughter here in the middle, right, got with this European guy, and that her grandson will become whiter. Right? So there's this idea of diluting, right, the Black population, right, of eventually, right, erasing it. Right? And I would say, right, that rhetoric, right, is still very much present today. And I would say actually present even in the US. Right? So we have this, these two different discourses of racial mixing, right, is what makes us unique, but we don't really want Blackness. Right? We only want Blackness to serve, right, for certain purposes, right, either for labor, right, or for sexual pleasure. So, okay, so going to pop culture here, right? So bringing us to the 1980s, 1990s, right? And here's where it gets interesting, right? This is Jennifer Beals from Flashdance, right? And what I would say in the US, right, is that there's a lot of fascination, right, and questioning, right, of mixed Black figures, even if they're not initially read as Black, right? It's these kind of subtle nuances, right, that are brought in, right, that very much go back into tropes of the Mulata as hypersexual, right, as sexually available, right, as needing and desiring white men, okay, and as needing somehow to be controlled or needing to be refined. Okay? And these tropes, right, just get rearticulated, right, again and again. And what I think starts to get interesting in the 1990s is that we start to also get in the US questionings of racial categories themselves. Right, so the 2000 census was the first census where you could check more than one box. Right, and it brings about a questioning of who's going to identify as Black, right, or not. Right, are we going to remake, right, these racial categories? Now the conservatives latched onto this and they're like, yeah, this sounds like a great idea because hopefully we can now do away, right? And we see this actually happening in the courts right now with, if we don't know who's Black or not, then I guess we don't need affirmative action. That's the same thing that's happening in Brazil right now because they started affirmative action in the 2000s, right? Their defense is, well, how do we know who's Black or not? Okay, so who should qualify? Actually, talking about race is racist. Okay, Halle Berry here, hey, this cover is from Ebony magazine, right? Also got attacked, right, for how she chooses to identify, and then how she chooses to see her daughter as Black, right? Where she got attacked for saying, I believe in the one drop rule. And really, what she's articulating here is a historical sense of Black identity, but also political sense of Black identity. Yet, if we look at how she's represented most of the time, she's often represented, right, as completely sexually available. The roles that she gets praised for, right, are ones in which she's presented, right, as hypersexual and in interracial relationships with white men. Okay. Now, Camila Pitanga in Brazil is fascinating, right? So she is usually not read as Black, but she has, often been marketed, right, as literally the synthesis of Brazil, right? This, icon of the Mulata herself. But she chooses to identify as Black politically, right? It's a political statement for her, right? Chooses to align her fate, right, with that of Afro-Brazilians. Yet the roles that she plays, right, there's very few roles for Afro-Brazilian actresses, right? It's basically her and this other actress, Thaís Araújo. Okay? just to tell you something, they didn't get the first Afro-Brazilian female protagonist on primetime television, I think, until 2009. Okay, so considering, right, that, you know, the large Black population there, it says a lot about who the image of the nation is. But yet the roles that she plays are the typical ones where she plays a maid, right? This white guy discovers her, realizes, you know, how you know, she you know, could be marriageable, basically saves her from being, you know, working as a domestic, and yet you never see her Black family. And I would say this happens in the US too. And what that does is it allows you to see them as already divorcing themselves from Blackness, okay, as already being able to enter into whiteness. And of course, like any telenovela, it has to end up with her pregnant, right? But this goes back to this whitening rhetoric, right? Of the purpose, right, of her is to actually whiten the nation. And this is what I would say is the good Morena, right? In Brazil, this is the you know, the ideal one. The bad one, right, which I would say is actually more the Mulata figure, is one in which she's totally hypersexual. She's literally, in this one, she's actually a sex worker, right? And she's scheming and manipulative all the time to try to ascend, right, into you know, a different social class. And the end of this telenovela, she you know, ends up pregnant, but ends up with a miscarriage and goes to jail. Okay, and what that's doing is it's punishing and disciplining Black women's bodies for failing to adhere, okay, to these normative ideas of race, gender, and sexuality. Okay, so it's about, again, sexual pleasure, whereas I would say the other one, marriage, is actually really labor, right? Literally in the sense it's reproductive labor. Okay, and I would say this US is not that different. Right? So here with Monsters Ball, right? So Halle Berry, right, won, you know, her Oscar, right, for this role. And the most praised scenes by film critics, which, by the way, right, film criticism tends to be overwhelmingly white and male, was for that infamous sex scene, right, in which she's tearing off her clothes, right, right, just literally tearing off her clothes, right, and saying, "Make me feel good." And in this role, right, literally the only two Black men in her life, or actually the only two Black people in her life, have to die, right? Die, right, in order so that this character of Hank, right, who was totally openly racist, right, literally had executed her ex-husband, right, if you haven't seen this film, and she relies on him, okay, and it allows him to be seen as the savior, okay. So it becomes, again, this idea of Black women's bodies are there to serve white men, right? Either for sexual labor, right? And allows the US to pat themselves on the back and see, we're not racist. If we all just kind of got it on with each other, right, across racial lines, we wouldn't have any more racism. And I would say even in other shows that, again, think of themselves as progressive, right? So this one is from The L Word, which was really groundbreaking in the 2000s, right, for portraying queer women. And going back to Jennifer Beals again, she actually asked for her character to be written explicitly as mixed race. Okay. But still, even within this role, right, she was presented as, you know, extremely accomplished. Right? She, you know, is an art curator, but yet she, again, is hypersexual. Right, continuously, right, and right, her white partner, right, is often presented, right, as, right, the kind of moral compass, right, here. So again, right, these trajectories, right, of always presenting Black femininity actually as a problem and as deviant. And I would say this absolutely goes into how the US also imagines Brazilian women. Okay, so many of you probably know the song here. I'm gonna go in.
You know, telefone.
E aí?
Yo, dog, we on the way to do the video.
For shit.
can see, I was kind of getting to the next one, right? This is how the US, right? I would actually say the African-American male gaze, right, of Black women. Similar, this is from Will I Am.
Ladies, here we go. Baby, what you get your body from? Tell me what you get your body from. Baby, what you get your body from? Tell me what you get your body from. I got it.
Okay, you can kind of probably guess what happens next. And what I would say here is that part of the fascination with Brazil, right, especially for African Americans, has been that it's this place of freedom, of relative freedom. And I would say for the way that's presented in popular media, right, is that for African American men, the male gaze, it becomes a place of sexual freedom. Okay. Now, these are the same women that are back home, right? They look exactly the same. Okay. But here, right, in Brazil, right, it's presented as they're sexually available. And what happens is that African American men actually become complicit and enactors, okay, of white imperialist patriarchy. Okay. And again, this is part of, right, of the way in which Brazil is imagined, right, of the way that Brazil has projected itself to the world, but also has to do with how Brazil becomes a mirror to the United States. Okay. So really thinking about how is Brazil represented as this tropical, exotic paradise? Okay. And actually, how does thinking about Brazil actually say something about the US? Okay. So I think often the way that we imagine Brazil actually has more to do with our own racial anxieties and sexual desires. Okay. So even if we take a film like Fast Five, right, that's set in Brazil, right, Fast Five and the whole Fast and the Furious series, right, and it assembles this like multiracial utopia. Right, their team is good and they're able to thrive, right, because they're literally this, you know, Benetton ad, right, of what makes, right, the US supposedly great, right, is actually its multiculturalism and racial diversity. You place that then into the Brazilian setting, right, and it actually becomes a way for the US to deal with its own possibilities of its own racial future. Right, so for example, the multiracial population in the US right now is only 3%, but it's the fastest growing population, right, in the United States. Right, by 2050, as many of us know, the majority of the US will be non-white. Right? So this is really a way to kind of manage those racial anxieties. And part of that is also having interracial intimacies as well as our fears and desires displaced in Brazil. Okay? So in Brazil, right, Black men, right, such as Vin Diesel, who is interesting, right, he's kind of his own mulatto figure, right, he's actually also of African descent, but he's read very ambiguously, right, he's allowed to get with white women, right, in Brazil, which he never could, right, in the US, right, because the idea of Black men, right, getting with white women, woo, right, these are what part of the riots about Brown versus Board were about, right, this fear that once we desegregate, right, we're going to have a whole lot of racial mixing going on. We're not going to know who's Black. We're not going to know who's white. And it's going to be the end of the US. Okay. So it becomes a way to talk about the US, but do it in a place that seems exotic and distant, yet a little bit similar. Okay. And I think the US actually does this a lot, right? Particularly when you think about the Olympics. Okay. So the Olympics, right, Brazil presented itself previously as, you know, a pretty white nation. By the time it gets to the Olympics, or whoa, we're going to talk about colonization, right? We're going to talk about slavery. And the way that NBC talks about it is to say, you know, their histories of immigration. I mean, I'm like, wait, what? No. Colonization and slavery are not immigration, right? And that's really what I would say is that Brazil becomes a way for the US to deny its own histories, right, of slavery and colonization. Okay? It's a way to disavow ourselves and to make ourselves exceptionalist again. Okay, so I could go on, but I am, right, would love to get to the Q&A. And what I would say is, representation does matter. I do see definitely shifts, right, that are happening. When I wrote this book initially, I was foolishly optimistic, right? It was the time of Barack Obama, Lula da Silva, and Dilma Rousseff, in which there were actually many gains for Black Americans and Afro Brazilians, and we are where we are now. But what I would say is that again, representation does matter of seeing shifts in how Black femininity and Black womanhood is presented, right, allows us to think about who might be leaders, okay? And that can be anything from how Harris, right, is talked about, but we still see these racist tropes coming in, right, and how she's talked about, but I have hope, to Marielle Franco, who was a openly queer, right, Afro-Brazilian feminist who was assassinated in Brazil in 2018. Okay, so it was also a Brazilian politician, right, but assassinated really for her views, right, and for working actually to try to change, right, these systems of systemic racism and patriarchy. Right. But what I would say is I'm hoping that we will get into a phase of unapologetic Black womanhood, but we'll see, right? I would love to hear feedback from all of you now, and I think I'll just leave it there because I'll be all night and no one has time for that.
Thank you, Jasmine. People put some ones or exclamations in the chat if you got a lot from everything she shared with us. Snaps to you. I was fully engaged. I was like, let's make sure we have time for Q&A. And right now I was like, how many slides? Because I'm learning so much. Of course, you're a professor with some lucky students. I know you're teaching virtually right now. If you're that engaging, then they're getting a lot. I see bravos and yeah. I went to school when Jasmine was in school. I knew you were pretty amazing in track. Did not realize that your incredible mind, was able to put together so much. I loved how you kind of talked about the reckoning with our history, and brought some live examples of movies that I watch, right? Maybe not thinking about what that's perpetuating in my understanding of race, and just tying that all together. I know that in the Americas, the history of colonization and the Middle Passage, and every country kind of has its own evolution of how that all came together. But those are some of the yeah, I hear Chase commenting on the Snoop and Pharrell song here, but yeah, I wanted to offer for folks to lend your voices to the space. Like if you have a specific question for the next, couple of minutes, you can raise your hand. I'll call on you. If you prefer, you can throw some messages in the chat box as well. But I can kick it off as folks, gather if they have things they want to ask Jasmine specifically. I'll actually pass it to Tamika, and you can just unmute yourself, Tamika.
Woohoo, I love you, Jasmine, and I want to hug you and your mother. Your mother's so great. Okay, so my question is, super proud of you in this work. I feel like, it's just always a blessing to see such like a spectrum of faces in these conversations. That's just Andoverland. That's what we do. My question is, what advice would you give in opening up spaces for this critical discourse within the Black community specifically? I find that these conversations around colorism are really hard to unpack. Even if you take something like the debate, Kamala was killing it, but then it's like, had she been darker than a paper bag, would that have come off the same way, right? So it's like, it's hard to, I feel like, we have to kind of calibrate within our community and then kind of open it up. And then granted, I'm super grateful for, again, the spectrum of faces here, but it's almost harder to have this conversation within the Black community. So what would your advice or counsel be around that?
Oh man, I want to say like the same for any. There's going to be lots of mistakes. There'll probably be. I even tell my students this. I was like, probably a lot of you might cry in this class, and they actually do. But I actually think it's like that can actually be a good thing, right? When we're feeling uncomfortable, right? And that's how we grow. But I think it's really having a reckoning with who we think we are, right? Because I think there's often this thought that if we have to appear unified, right, and we can't air out our dirty laundry, right, that we don't want. So we'll talk about colorism later, right, or we'll talk about, right, the rampant sexism and misogyny, right, within Black communities, or homophobia, right, we'll talk about that later, right? But the time to talk about it is it's now. And I think a lot of that is reflecting on our histories together, reflecting on why are there the tensions, right? And then also, what are our solidarities, right? So even going back to Harris, right? There was that whole nonsense of, at least I thought, it's nonsense of it, is she Black? Like, of course she is. Right? That's, the rest of the world is not only going to view her as Black, right, but she publicly identifies, right, as Black. And not to say that we shouldn't have a conversation about colorism, right, but seeking to tear each other down like that, right, because the real enemy is white supremacy, right? That's the real enemy there. So we need to work on these issues, right? But this whole kind of, questioning, right, even of her identity, right? I was like, well, you can be both. Right? You can absolutely be both. But also, I think of lighter skinned, right, Black individuals, right, acknowledging, right, the privileges that they have and using that to open up other spaces. Right? And within for men, right, for also, right, understanding of not making one's fate, right, tied to being aligned with white patriarchy. Because that's what I see a lot. And I was like, okay, you want to go over there, right? Because you want to be with the white men, but you're willing, right, to kind of kick down the Black woman to get in that door while using them at the same time. And I think those are tough conversations, right, that need to be had in terms of, right, what are actually the objectives?
Right. I mean, I agree that of those being the objectives and the end goals, I'm just wondering, how do you cultivate like the safety? You know what I mean? Like, how do you actually? But again, I'll let somebody else. I'll call you later, girl.
Well, I think that's a good question though. So yeah, we'll chat later. Those are things I'm still trying to have, but to be honest, that's actually why I really love using popular media, right? Because it seems so trivial, right? And getting, or that's why I, personally, my classes like using it. But I think actually understanding more of our histories and also understanding, right, the way in which our sets of beliefs and values are being formed, right, and trying to do that, right, with each other, but being willing to be present and being willing to be uncomfortable. But yeah, I agree. It's not easy. We'll have to chat later.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tamika, for kicking us off. I see a hand raised, and I will first start with one of the questions I see in the chat, which is speaking to your point of enjoying using media to exemplify your points. Someone asked, did you get any feedback from anyone in the film industry after the publication of the book?
Oh, interesting. Well, the book just came out, and academic books, right, are kind of weird, right, in the sense that they're often really written for academic audiences, right? Although I hope this one gets more public appeal, but that's just part of the process of getting tenure, et cetera, et cetera. And since it was recent, I haven't gotten a lot of feedback from people in the film industry, although TV Global, right, it was really skittish about even giving me access. Okay, so TV Global is the main Brazilian media company. Okay, and I think that is, I would have to do like these whole like big write-ups about what I was doing, what exactly I was doing. And honestly, I would actually often change slightly what I said I was doing. And I would say, I'm interested in looking at representation of Afro-descendants. Because I knew if I said, I want to critique or I'm interested in looking at how white supremacy is working, they weren't going to let me in. Okay, that they weren't gonna, one, let me visit the TV where they're filming in the TV studios. When I would go in, right, for the telenovela transcripts, I wasn't allowed to take anything in with me, not even a piece of paper. right? So there's just a lot of suspicion. And even in university spaces in Brazil, because again, like I said, most university spaces are very white. When I would talk with professors, openly about racism, they would often close their doors because they didn't want their colleagues to hear, right? Because there's such a disavowal of racism and this idea that talking about race itself is racist, and that this is some US idea that is going to somehow make Brazil racist, right? That by talking about race, right, that's going to bring US style racism in. But no, I would actually love to hear from people in the film industry if anyone is in it or has context there. I'd love to get feedback.
Yeah, and we'll be sharing all the links to be able to access Jasmine's book and share it within your network. So look out for that before we get off the call. I was just thinking about consumption in media and like perpetuating the same stories. And I've been trying to better curate what I'm ingesting. Sometimes I like a song pretty fine, but like how much of that story is repeated. I was just thinking about Olivia Wilde creating a movie recently, and I heard her say, instead of making it like the mean girl on one side and like the bully, it was just actually friends that got together and were young people, and like in the spaces we occupy and the content we write and create, we can kind of change in such little ways the story. And that's just
yeah.
I'd like to actually
more Black filmmakers, right? Like Tamika, actually, right? Like shout out to Tamika, right? Because a lot of it we're thinking about media industries and production, right? There's very little diversity, right, in there. So it's also being able to have, right, more diversity within the media industry, right, to tell different stories. Because frankly, right, more diversity actually just makes better stories, right? It's more interesting, right? But we need to also have some ownership, right, over how those stories get told, right? And who gets to, right, have control over representation.
Absolutely. I see a question from Ms. Sykes, but first I'd like to see if Christina Mather, 99, wanted to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi. Hi, Jasmine. It's good to see you. Yeah. I don't know if I've seen you since 1999.
No.
But I was very excited about this talk, one, because I remember you fondly, but also I was very excited about your title which is actually brings me to my second question. But my first question is, as you were talking, and I love popular culture and media. So, I mean, I don't love media, but I kept thinking of Rashida Jones and Kenya Barris. And so I'm very curious because Mixed Dish has been on my watch list for some time, if you want to say anything about his work. But also I had a personal encounter a couple of years ago with a new acquaintance at the time, still an acquaintance, probably because of this encounter. But he was from Brazil, and it was very superficial conversation talking about racism, and then he said, you Americans with your obsession with racism, I'm from Sao Paulo, we don't have racism there, we use, the N-word, and he used it, like openly, because it's just not a thing. And I was flabbergasted, and I didn't know. And so I was really happy when I saw your title, because I was like, oh, I didn't know about that even history of not acknowledging that reputation, because never having been to Brazil. So besides sending him your book, I'm kind of curious, and I probably won't because I don't know him well enough, curious, like what is if you have any feedback about a response that I could have said at the moment, not that you had to put that on you, but just having lived through that. Those are my two questions.
Yeah, well, I think actually both countries, right, have this complete denial, right, of racism, right? And that it somehow becomes an insult, right? We even saw that last night in the VP debates, right? Where, I'm going to just bring politics into it, right? Where Pence is like, no, this is insulting. I'm like, what's insulting is racism, right? That's what's insulting. But what I would say, right, is, well, one, actually going back to the title. So I actually got some pushback on using the title, the word Mulata, right? Because in the US, it has really a burdened history, right? We're often thinking about like the tragic Mulata, right, in which this figure often dies, right, as punishment, for being the product of racial mixing herself. Right? So she had, it has this real baggage to her. And in Brazil, it is often really associated with sex, right? But sometimes it's seen as a compliment, right? Right, saying like, okay, mulata, right? And really it's saying like, I think you're sexy, or I want to have sex with you. And like, both are actually really misogynistic, right? Racialized, right? Ways of blaming Black women, right? Constantly, right? For their own predicaments. And so I wanted also to use that term mulata precisely because it makes people uncomfortable. Right? And we're like, oh, that's an antiquated term. Like, no, I want to use it because we're still haunted, right, by slavery. And that's what I would say too, right? In Brazil, right, they're still haunted, right, by slavery, right? So they can erase it, right? Literally, right, slave records, right, were burnt, right, after emancipation. Right? Like literally, right? They're like, no, this never happened here, or they try to make slavery sound like, oh, it wasn't that bad, right? It, it wasn't like the U.S., right? It was kind of like this. Literally, one of the titles of the very famous Brazilian academic books is called "The Master and the Slaves," and it makes it seem like it's this paternalistic relationship of there's this white enslaver who seduced by a mulatto woman, there's the kind of the Black mammy figure, and they're all one big happy family. And what I would say is that legacy is actually still in Brazil, right? So most Afro-Brazilians are poor, right, and often work in the homes, right, of white employers. It's still, right, we've just re-articulated it, right? We've never got past, right, the actual legacies, right, of slavery at all, right? But part of why it's maintained is precisely because we disavow it, and that's what helps maintain white supremacy in the first place, right? Is by continuing to deny it, right? It actually works to uphold it. And I think I forgot your other question. I'm sorry.
It was about Kenya Barris. And
yeah. Okay, so yeah, actually one of like the last parts of my book talks about Rashida Jones, and how she's racialized, I think, differently. And again, this goes a lot to phenotype and how you're perceived. And she actually has a lot of similarities with this other actress I look at, Camila Pitanga in Brazil, because they both proclaim like, we're Black, right? And they have these famous Black fathers. But what I would say is actually it's the inability to actually understand Blackness, right? Of that, this idea of we see Blackness when we can see it, right? This idea that we can see it. But what I would say is that I think there is a pivot happening now, like with figures like Rashida Jones, right? Zendaya, Tessa Thompson, right? To have mixed Blackness be used, right, also in a political sense, right? Of Blackness also as a political identity. I have to say though, I'm a big fan of Blackish. I couldn't get past the first Mixed Gist episode because it made it seem like this racial mixing was something new. And like this is, they have them in a commune, so it made it sound like they were weird and racial mixing is weird, and I just had to turn it off. So maybe I need to give it another chance, but it really turned me off as presenting interracial families as somehow abnormal or as racially mixed people as somehow brand new. But maybe I need to give it another chance.
Thanks, Christina. I also saw a question from Miss Becky Sykes. Would you mind unmuting yourself? Thanks.
Hi, thanks, Lethy. And hi, Jasmine. Great to see you. And thank you so much for that really fascinating presentation. So my question was, if or when Kamala Harris becomes president, do you think that we're in for the same kind of assertion that we will then be sort of post-Mulata in the way that we were post-racial after Obama's election?
Oh, that's a really good question. So I actually rewrote right, my epilogue and introduction after Trump and Bolsonaro were elected. Because what it made me realize, right, is that these little glimmers, right, or spaces in which there's like, oh, we've made so much racial progress, right, or things are getting better, right? But the white supremacists, okay, and misogynists haven't gone away. They're still there, right? And they're still going to be there, right? Even if Harris, right, is elected, right? Which I hope, right? But even if she is elected, and I think also what we, what we saw both in Brazil and the U.S., right, is precisely because gains, right, were being made by Afro-Brazilians, right, and African Americans and other people of color in the U.S. It's precisely, right, why, right, all these gains are being rolled back, right, and why we're seeing also these overtly racist, right, and misogynistic, right, attacks at the same time that there's this denial of systemic racism. Right? So I admit I think that the idea of the post Mulata, right, will get utilized, but I think it will get utilized, right, to try to deny racism, right, while actually allowing white supremacy, right, to be bubbling there on the surface, right, until we actually see systemic change, right? Because a figurehead, and she can do a lot, but it's over multiple institutions.
Great. I agree. Thanks so much, Jasmine.
Thank you. And I see Dr. Vidal is on the call, so I wanted to give you a minute if you wouldn't mind jumping in on anything. Before that, I was going to ask you, Jasmine, you talk about the true issue is white supremacy. You've talked also about anti-Blackness. I know it's like a spectrum, but it exists globally, but there's like a US context. I'm just curious, when we're trying to combat these kind of larger systemic issues of anti-Blackness, white supremacy, what are some ideas you have about it within our institutions, kind of, what are some ways that changing our perception about the Mulata can start to impact the ways that we're moving the needle within the systems that we occupy and the spaces we occupy?
Sure. Well, I think a lot of the representations of the Mulata, and this is where I think we might start to see shifts in popular media representations, she actually has no agency. Usually we actually know nothing about her. And that I think is because in really globally, but I think particularly in the US and Brazil, it's still a failure to see Black humanity, right? And to recognize Black humanity. I also think that often these representations, right, are about sexual desire, right? While wanting, and racial anxieties, right, and sexual anxieties, while also wanting to contain Blackness, right, as a workforce, right, or the commodification, literally, of Black people's bodies, right, whether that be in sports, right, because that's actually kind of like my next project, right, when I'm hoping to write about men actually soon, because I often get questions about, like, what about the men? Whether that be in sports, right, whether that be in films, whether it be in TV, whether that literally be over who we employ, okay? And often I also think that a lot of it gets used, right, this mixed Black female figure gets used of what's considered palatable or acceptable, right? Of, oh, we want someone who's kind of Black, but not that kind of Black, right? Because Blackness is associated so often with deviance, right? That's really, it's about this idea, right, of taking out, right, the Blackness that we want, right, with leaving, right, this Black population that we don't want behind, right? And that's everything from thinking about the mass importation of European immigration, right, to the type of segregation that we have today, right? But what I would say is that, media, it's just one institution, right? It's our educational institutions, right? What we teach, right? Literally, even thinking about like what we're teaching, right? Who are we reading? How is history being taught, right? And for whom, right? Our political institutions, right? How are those voting districts drawn? Right? Our religious institutions, right? It grows across, right, the, you know, the whole board. But hopefully, you know, what I am hoping is, especially as we have more diversity within media industries, that the way that we actually envision the world will start to change and shift so that we can also restructure these other institutions.
Thanks for indulging me. Like, how do we do this? But Dr. Vidal, would you be open? I know you teach English at PA, correct? And director of the Brace Center for Gender Studies. And you're from Brazil, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, I'd love to hear if you have any thoughts, and I'll catch the additional questions after Dr. Vidal.
Awesome. So yeah, oh my God, do I have thoughts? I have many, many, many thoughts. Thank you so much, Jasmine, for all of this. I don't even know where to start. I guess, because there's like 4 different questions in my head. Mm-hmm. I guess one question that I probably wanna make sure I ask is, in your research, and I'm so glad you brought up Gilberto Freire's The Masters and the Slaves, right, which is this seminal text from the 1930s that came up with this idea of Brazil as, I mean, this false trope of Brazil as a racial paradise. Interestingly, after he traveled to the US and saw what was happening in the US, and then went back home and said, oh, no, things are great here, right? We are not the US. So that comparative perspective has been going on for a while. But the fascinating thing for me with that book is the idea in which the translation into English has missed what I think personally is a very important piece of racial constructs in Brazil, and I would love to hear your opinion about that. The original title in Portuguese of that book is Casa Grande in Senzala, which literally means the big house and the slave quarters. Mm-hmm. So it's not about the people necessarily, right? The translation is the masters and the slaves. Mm-hmm. The original is the places, it's the spaces. And I think one of the ways in which Freire constructs his very flawed argument, but I think he's onto something, which is the fluidity that exists in those spaces. And he talks about, of course, the masters going into the slave quarters, and of course, the female slaves who were in the house and who then become the ones, of course, who, you know, bear the children that lead to all of these mixed race descendants and, you know, come up with Brazilian society as it is nowadays. So the spatial thing, I think, is huge in Brazil in ways that is not here. And I would love to hear your thoughts about it, because in my experience, somebody's racial identity in Brazil very much depends on where they are, both different states in the country where, you know, they can be compared to people of, you know, different skin colors, and also even spaces within, you know, the place where they live, like, for example, elevators in buildings and things like that. So I'd just love to hear your thoughts on that.
Oh gosh, yeah, there's so much. That could be a whole nother book there, right? You know, part of what I also argue in my book is that racialization is actually not just phenotype. So I use, for example, the same actress, Camila Pitanga, right, to argue that, right, it's actually not about her phenotype, right? It's the same actress, she looks the same, right? But it's about how her sexuality is being presented. And that's how she plays actually these racially different roles, right? So you're right, right? So there's all these different terms, right, for how people refer to each other, right? So they might refer to each other as like Morena, which means brunette, or just a polite way to call someone Black because Black is such an insult, right? To Mulata, which I think has this like big sexual connotation to it. Okay. And so I think, you know, yeah, it's true, right, of thinking about who belongs in those spaces, right? And I think sexuality is huge, right? And that about how sexuality is being, right, presented, you know, but I found this, right, absolutely myself just from living there, right? Because I would have people insult, right, Black people in front of me, right? And, you know, then I would say, oh, you know, my mom's Black. And they would say, oh, I don't mean African Americans. right? You know, they're articulate and they're clean, and they start pointing, right, like to like all these reasons, right, why, right, they racialize African Americans in a different way, right? But in my own building in Sao Paulo, right, you know, I was also asked to take the service elevator, right? Because the service elevator, you know, exactly what you're talking about, these spaces, right? The service elevator, right, is for people who are, you know, domestics, right, or bringing up, you know, packages or, you know, whatever it is, and had this woman accuse me of stealing also my neighbor, like just, you know, just crazy things, right, where they went into my house. Anyway, I can have so many stories, right, of this, but I think you're right. A lot of it does have to do with this who belongs in these spaces. And that's what I actually found really interesting, that actually prompted me to write some of this book, was these experiences of being in what had been considered these elite white spaces. In some ways, some similarities to Andover, right, of what had been, you know, considered, right, who belongs in these spaces, who deserves to be here, and then a questioning, right, of why are you here? Okay, so it made me realize, like, oh, okay, so it only goes, you know, there's this idea of cordial, right, Brazilian cordiality, right, and these intimacies, right, that you might see people hanging out together, right, you know, at the beach, and you know, that's all fine and good. But if they go into the shopping mall, if they're on the airplane with you, oh no. So there's these spaces, right, where it's really about, you know, whiteness might be maintained, but once you go outside, right, it's all fine, right? But yet, right, people of darker skin tones, right, particularly those who would be considered like preto, right, you know, darker black, right, they're not seen as actually really fully belonging in terms of Brazilian citizenship. But you know, yeah, I think you're totally right on that, on the space and also the translation, right? And how these ideas, right, absolutely, right, move across space, right, of how Gilberto Freire got these ideas from studying at Columbia University and traveling in the South, right? And how our own ideas in the US, right, that we often, the US state thought of itself as superior because we weren't like Brazil, right? And we had segregation, right? And therefore we could preserve whiteness. Yeah, thanks for that.
Yeah, you spoke to it a little, Jasmine, but I saw Tara ask if you think language plays a role in perceptions of race and power as you're comparing US and Brazil. Are there other kind of examples that you can bring up of how that plays a factor?
Yeah, well, you mean in terms of translation, or just in terms of like of the uses of language to occlude race? I mean, I think there's often language that's coded, right? So in the US, right, we might say urban, right? And really everyone knows like that means black, right? And, you know, I think in Brazil, it gets really complicated because there's all these ways of wanting to skirt around using the term black. Okay? And I do think though that there's starting to be a shift, right? So the last census in Brazil, for example, was the first time that the majority of Brazilians identified as non-white. And that's not because the actual population grew. It's that there was a changing consciousness. Right? And so there is also a movement in Brazil to encourage people to self-identify as negra. Right? And negra, right, which also means black, has a different meaning to it, right? And that has a political valence to it, right? In which one is choosing to be black, right? And has a sense of diasporic pride, right, to it, rather than a category that's impinged upon you, right? So it was interesting to see, you know, as if more people, right, choose to identify with blackness or indigeneity. And, you know, going back to Flavia's comments on space, yeah, that's huge, right? I remember in some contexts, I remember I had one friend, you know, tell the doorman, you know, let anyone up here who's white, right? And then it dawned on me, well, she thinks I'm white. She thinks I'm white. And I got excited for him when I was like, am I going to take over the world? Like, what am I going to do? Because I wasn't used to that, right, in the US. And it made me realize, I was like, oh, it's because I'm well educated. And this was actually huge because I was an American, right? Because I was an American, I would treated so much better. So much so, sometimes I would speak English or bad Portuguese on purpose in different settings, right? So if I wanted to be treated better, right, in a store, right, I might actually speak English, and then the whole reaction to me would change, right? Or there's one incident with my now husband, I'll never forget. We were in this H. Stern factory. They make jewelry, and we're just kind of doing like a fun factory tour. And later they bring you to like, look at the jewelry, and they start talking to he's my boyfriend at the time, and he's very white, right? He's from Kansas, in English, and they're like, oh well, would you want to get anything? But I wouldn't get anything, for someone who looks like her. Like she's not gonna we weren't gonna buy anything anyway, right? But she's not gonna appreciate it, and especially, and like they're using this term Mulata. Oh, but I bet like you'll have a good night. All these really sexualized ways of talking about me, not realizing that I was American. So I'm just waiting, and then I respond back in English, right, and then in Portuguese, and then they start apologizing. Right, of, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, I didn't know. I was like, no, you're sorry because you got caught, right? You're sorry because you're saying racist, misogynistic things, right? And you realize, right, that I understand both Portuguese and English, and I want to talk to your manager.
Mm-hmm.
I saw a pretty comprehensive question from Arnold, so I'll give you a minute to let me know if you'd like to ask. But in the meantime, would Angela and Carter like to jump in and ask your question? Or I can ask it for you.
Yeah, I'm trying to unmute. Sorry about that. Thank you. Thank you, Jen, so much for this wonderful research and work that you presented. My question was particularly in the US. I have a hard time understanding the aversion that European Americans have with being labeled racist. In the past, when I say past, in the 60s, in the 50s, white people who were racist, I think Bull Connor, like in the South, they would have had a problem with being called a racist. They would have been proud of it. But now people who are racist, even like a David Duke, even a Donald Trump, they do racist things, but it's like, don't call me a racist. And I don't understand that. I don't understand why there's such an aversion when you're clearly racist, but you don't want to be associated with that term. And I just wondered if you had any insight to share on that, because Black people don't hold the power to punish racist behavior. So it's not as if you don't want to be called racist because Black people are going to punish you, because no, we don't have that power to do that. So yeah, so I wondered if you had any insight on that.
Yeah, well, I think racism is one thought of as something that's individual, and it's also thought of you have to be an individual overt racist, right? Rather, right, and I actually would say popular media actually also buttresses that idea, right? Of especially by having these films, like these racial redemption films, right? Like Monsters Ball or Gran Torino, right? Where you have these like straight up racists, and then they become the heroes, right? And you're like, we became the heroes because you had sex with a Black woman, right? Or you be like, what? And so I think that's part of really the individualistic nature also of the US, right? We're so focused on the individual, but also thinking of racism as something that an individual does rather than systemic, right? And something that actually many of us are complicit in, right? I also think, right, that has to do with the US also wants to think of itself as this beacon of freedom, right? And how do you have a beacon of freedom when there's racism? Right? How do you present ourselves, right, as, the US is the best when there's rampant racism? Right? So a lot of that I also think has to do with the global image, right, of the United States, especially if we're thinking about, for example, like the civil rights movement, right? There's many historians that argue, right, that the reason why there was legislation, right, is because, and I'm not saying we have to agree with this argument, but I think there is some, some different factors to it, was because it was making the US look bad, right? As compared to the Soviet Union. Where the Soviet Union's going around and saying, you're going to side with the US during the Cold War, black and brown countries of the world, when they have this going on. Right? And I think in part because of that, racism is thought of as something that's in the past. Right? And so then racism becomes something that's anti-American. So by accusing someone to be racist, it's saying that they're individually something wrong with them, right? That they're a relic of the past, right? And that they're also somehow anti-American, even when, right, they're actively working, right, to oppress other groups.
Yeah, I'm going to actually ask Arnold's question, but I also wanted to let folks know we're almost at time, so this will probably be the last question for this Q&A. But just keep in mind that Jasmine is happy to talk to anyone else, and like these are conversations we should continue to have. His question was again to the idea of self-labeling. He stated he thanked you first for your insight on such a profound and complicated topic. He's a Black man married to a mixed race female, Haitian and German, and who identifies as Black. He wanted to see if you had anything to say about that need or pressure to identify as Black when a multiracial group can easily identify as white as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, every country, right, has its own way, right, of managing race. Right? It does. But what I would say, right, they're just different strategies. Okay? But what it's really about is maintaining some kind of hierarchy. Okay? And we have to dislodge that hierarchy from attempting to adhere, right, to white supremacy. Right? So this even goes back to, Tamika's point earlier, right, of talking about colorism. Right? We have to dislodge, right, our ideas of beauty, okay, or our ideas, right, of status, right, of forming alliances, right, with the idea of whiteness, right, rather than, right, forging, right, solidarities with each other, right, to break down white supremacy, right, and also, right, this would also actually be beneficial to white people too. Right? Because it's active work all the time, right? To work within the service of white supremacy, right? Right? That's active work. So I do think though what we do see in the US, we don't have necessarily a right now at least, right? A straight up, mulatto category, although we did in the past, right? We did have that. We took that off the census, right? Is that I think we do have though a hierarchy in terms of color, right? And a hierarchy in terms of other groups, right, of color, right, that should be, right, I think, right, aligning themselves to break down white supremacy. But whiteness is often really tempting, right? There are, right, material, right, tangible, right, impacts, right, towards aligning oneself, right, with it. Okay. So I do think, in the US we have that, and I think other countries, right, have that too in terms of forming their own racial hierarchies. There was, I think, and actually I would still say, an attempt in the US, especially on the part of conservatives, to use multiracial to create a wedge, right? To create a wedge in the way that they identify to create a separate group. And really what that's about taking away resources. Right? That's about taking away, right, legislation, right? That's about being able to break down, right, racial policies. And how I identify, right, but also, what I argue in this book, right, is it's also not really seeing the whole spectrum of Blackness, right? So I identify as mixed and Black. Okay, you can be both, right? And that's part of actually the richness, right, of Blackness itself, right? Is that it has, right, different cultures, different languages, right, different colors, right, all, right, put in together, right? And why take that away? Right? Why? And so I do think that we can align ourselves with trying to take down hierarchies, and also beginning to think of Blackness as a political identity, as a political choice.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. I got to Andover and realized my Blackness in a different way. I grew up in a very Dominican neighborhood in New York, and I was like Dominican. And then because my community was students of color, that necessity to connect with other students of color and understand my Blackness in the context of a historically white institution means that I have intersectional identity. Then there's Latinx now, which is like, is it the word that society's using for it? Is it what you internalize as your identity? But I also saw Chase bring up that though white people being called racist might not be able to be, have negative impacts from people of color, yet in their jobs now, racism, is considered like not good. Like, what are some of the other impacts they may have when they identify their behaviors as race-based? And Dr. Sykes was also commenting on other places where the hierarchy and the spectrum has shown up. And I guess I just wanted to say, I'm walking away thinking that the story, your emphasis on media is helping me think about, like, everyone gets to tell their own story. Everybody gets to build our own identity. And kind of, if you're talking to someone and they're sharing with you what their experience has taught them about racialized America, about the correlation between how race is seen in Brazil and the US, it's like, never dismiss people's narratives. Those are facts, that is data, and that is kind of a way to humanize the folks that you talk to in these racial discussions. White people, white supremacy means white people have to take on this construct in the US of being white, but whiteness could mean Polish, Russian, Cuban, it depends on like how you present, and you don't want to lose those pieces of culture and history of your people and where you come from and how you migrated into this country to become white either. Like, that's a loss for white people too. And so it's like, yes, politically I identify as Black, and I can also hold all the things about my personal culture as we advance these conversations. And Jasmine and Jenny, I just wanted to offer you all to say any additional words. I know we're about to share the links, like, let's support this great alum who has such a vast knowledge to share on this subject. And yeah, reach out to her with additional questions or opportunities to share more about her book. But I'll ask if Jenny, if you have any other things to say, and Jasmine, maybe you could close us out.
I would just say thank you to both. It's Jasmine, thank you. Somebody said, they enjoyed being in your class. I felt the same way. I actually was taking notes. It's like you just fall into the habit of actually being in class. So you're taking notes. I have several pages of notes here that I look forward to reflecting and revisiting for my own thinking. Letty, it is not easy to moderate. That chat was on fire, so that's awesome. But thank you very much for taking that on and bringing your good energy tonight too. I'm grateful to see that the screens of faces and the time that people come together as Andover, and as you came to the place in the 01810 to learn. We love that the learning continues, and that's because you go on to continue this brilliance. And so thank you, Jasmine, so much for sharing with us.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me. I feel so grateful for being part of this Andover community and seeing faces I haven't seen before. Like, I see Trap, I'm so excited. In years, for just, being able to be in this space and to actually learn from, one another. And I go on and on about Andover all the time, so much so that, my other friends are like, oh my God, part of some like weird cults or something. Like, what is this? But, I really do think Andover holds the possibility, right, for the best of what we could be, and for even being able to have discussions like this. So I want to thank you, Jenny and Letty, and I really want to thank everyone here for giving up your time tonight to learn with me and learn from one another. And if you ever want to hear more, you can always just give me an email. There's other things I'm working on. I love chatting or even coming in to your classes, even high school classes. I actually like doing that too. Middle school sometimes is fun. They're a different set. But I'd love to just keep the conversation going, because I think that's really how we move forward, is just by continuing to talk, making mistakes, and then discussing some more and reflecting. So thank you, everyone.
Yeah, we wish you a
Thank you
wonderful
all.
night. Stay tuned for more PA events, and see you all soon.
Thank
Stay well.
All right.
Night, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.